Great. Just a couple of things about Western Center. So we're a statewide organization that supports and does all kinds of anti-poverty work, basically. And we do all of our work through an explicitly racial justice lens, recognizing that poverty does not affect all communities equally, and our whole country is built on deeply racist policies and institutions. And so all of our work is sort of based in that frame. And I particularly work on housing issues. And personally, I started my career working at a hospital in Boston that primarily served a Black community that was around the hospital. There was a lot of public housing there, and worked in a medical legal collaborative, so explicitly focusing on the health and legal sort of intersection. And I worked with a lot of families whose kids had asthma because they lived in unsafe conditions. And so that's sort of that's my personal grounding in this work. So this is very dear to my heart, and I'm really grateful to be here with you today, and I just appreciate all the incredible work that all of you are doing in this crisis. It's just impossible to meet the need. And then sort of more context specifically on what we're going to talk about today. So we have been working with many partners, many people probably who are here today, from the beginning of this crisis, asking our statewide policymakers to please just pass blanket protections stopping evictions, because we know that eviction is tremendously harmful to health. We know that it impacts communities of color more than other people. And we know that doing these piecemeal things is just going to leave so many people unprotected. And so we have been advocating just tirelessly forever, and I am sorry that we were not more successful. But up until eventually in April, we did get protections from the courts, where the courts sort of did a blanket stop on eviction cases in the courts, but those expired at the beginning of September. And so what I'm going to talk about today is kind of the different pieces that are now in place statewide to protect tenants. And I know also that there are so many local protections that are layered on, and I'm going to kind of explain a little bit about how that works. But I have to do this giant disclaimer that, as Will mentioned, I mean, this is so complicated. Like what I've been doing for my last 12 years of my career is housing law. That's all I do all the time. And it has taken me such a long time to get my head around this. So it's hard for me to make it anything but complicated, because it's just kind of a mess. So I apologize in advance. And also my slides are so ugly. I know how to make a nice PowerPoint with pictures and graphics, but I just have not had time to do that because I'm working all the time. So those are my big disclaimers. And with that, can we have the next slide, please? So I just want to start here with just this big, bold letters announcement. I know that these protections are just really hard to use. And I know about all the horrible stuff that landlords are doing, forcing people out of their homes, or just some people get an eviction notice and they're just terrified, even if there's no legal basis for it and it's, it's illegal for the landlord to try and evict someone. People get scared and they move out. So I just want to start with that. It's just, I'm always trying to encourage people. It's really frightening to not be able to pay your rent. It's really scary for landlords harassing you, but you have rights. And in a pandemic, if you're getting a notice, please don't just immediately leave your home, because you have the right to have a judge look at your case. There are free legal resources available, not enough. Be totally honest about that, but I just really always want to encourage people to know that they have rights. It is against the law for a landlord to lock someone out. Because even if the person hasn't paid rent for 6 months, the landlord cannot change the locks or turn off the power or do anything like that. And there are protections, and landlords have to pay fines. There's actually criminal penalties. I know that those are hard to enforce, but I want people to sort of that to be the frame. And the only way for a landlord to legally lock someone out, or to legally evict someone, is to do a court case. And then a sheriff has to do the lockout, and someone needs to go on mute who's not on mute. So that's just sort of the starting place. You don't have to leave. Even if your landlord gives you an eviction notice, that doesn't mean you just have to leave. There's a whole process, and you have rights. I don't know if the host can mute everyone. Yeah. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay. So I have here a resource. I know people are aware of legal aid, but just if you're working with someone who's in a community that you're not as familiar with, this website has information about free legal services for low-income people. And so if someone does get an eviction notice, that's the first thing to do. And I also wanted to just highlight in the CDC protection from the federal government that I'll talk about a little bit later, there's actually giant penalties for landlords who evict someone illegally. A landlord could have to pay $100,000. And then if a tenant dies as a result of being evicted illegally, it's like $500,000. And no one's life, obviously there's no price for someone's life, but I wanted to highlight that because I think that many times people who don't do this work don't understand the harm of an eviction and don't understand that it is an issue of life and death. I mean, I've had clients who have come to me too late that I wasn't able to help me and they have passed away. And it's just really horrible and it's heartbreaking. And the CDC declaration really acknowledges that in a way that I haven't seen in any of our state laws. Like, this is a profound harm when someone is evicted. So I just wanted to flag that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start here by just framing the kind of world that we're in with all of these different protections. So the CDC order that I just mentioned, that is a federal law issued by the Center for Disease Control, not the usual housing work, right? But we have a total fail on the federal administration on every level. So the CDC jumps in and does this. And what it says is that it stops evictions for some tenants who qualify for these kind of complicated protections. And it's just a pause. It says you can't, if you qualify for these protections, you cannot be evicted until December 31st, 2020. It's quite complicated and long, but that's the sort of general summary. And then we have state law. I know everyone's familiar. And as Will was mentioning, it is so complicated. I think it's like 68 single-spaced tiny font pages. And so this is a state law that the idea of it is that it's supposed to permanently protect tenants who are not able to pay their rent for this covered period, and I'll talk more about that. And, you know, we were, my colleagues were advocating when this whole process was happening and fought so, I mean, I know some people in this room were also in these conversations. Many people fought very hard to get something much better than this, and just, the realtors have a lot of money. I'll leave it there, but it's very complicated and I'm gonna try to explain it. And then on top of this, many awesome communities have done fantastic things at the local level, really great protections that are, some of them are very simple to use. And those are kind of overlaid on these other ones. And I'll explain at the end, I'll attempt to explain at the end how these things work together. It's quite confusing. Next slide, please. So the general way that most of these protections work, and the CDC and the state law both do work this way, and as well as many local laws, is that the tenants have to give the landlord a declaration basically saying, this is why I can't pay rent. And the declaration, what that means is just a sworn statement where the tenant is saying, I swear to tell the truth, all the things in here are true. And I just can't see the slides anymore, but that's okay. So the way the law is structured is the tenant is signing the statement that this is the reason that I can't pay the rent, and then they have to give that to the landlord. And the sort of specifics about that, how that happened, are different in each law, but I'll try to explain that. And I'm sure we'll get the slides back in a moment. And some sort of tips about how this works. Unfortunately, in my experience, I used to do individual work where I just defended tenants from eviction, and it's very hard. And one of the things that happens, unfortunately, is the tenant will give a landlord something, and then the landlord will pretend that they didn't get it. And so a really important thing to do when you're helping someone who's dealing with this is, sorry for the background noise, is to make the tenant, make sure the tenant takes a picture of the declaration. So if they're submitting a paper to their landlord, take a picture of it and some kind of proof that you sent it. And there's different ways to do that. Certified mail costs money, unfortunately, but you can also get the post office to give you a receipt saying that you sent something. So it's always just really important to keep proof when you send a landlord something. And the state law 3088, unfortunately, we're on the, can you go to the next slide, please? State law requires that the tenant has to submit this declaration every month. So that is quite burdensome, but that's just something to be aware of. And I think that this is true. I don't think there's any protection. I'm not aware of any local protection that has said rent is canceled. So definitely for state law and for the CDC, it's not as if the debt is erased. The tenant still owes the rent. It's just that they can't be evicted for it right now. So that's important for people to know, that eventually that money is still there, the debt is still there. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, but the way that state law says it is that the landlord can still collect the money through small claims court, but that won't happen until in 2021. So I hope I'm not totally confusing everyone. It's really hard to explain these things. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to focus on AB 3088 because I can't possibly explain all of these things in this period of time, but also because the state law is actually the most protective. It's more protective than the CDC order if the tenant's able to follow all the procedures, because it is saying you can never be evicted for that rental debt, whereas the CDC order is just sort of pressing the pause button. And if you just had the CDC order in January, the landlord could say, oh, hey, you owe all these months of rent, now I'm going to evict you. So state law is providing sort of a permanent thing that says you will not be evicted for that debt. You do owe the money, but you can't be evicted for it. So that's why I'm going to focus on the state law. So the way the state law works is that landlords are supposed to give their tenants multiple notices. Again, this is just going to be really confusing, which is frustrating. People are already overwhelmed and dealing with a pandemic, and now they're going to get all these confusing notices. So it requires a landlord to send this general notice that just says, hey, tenant, you owe rent. Here's some rights you have under state law. And then the landlord also has to give the tenant a specific notice saying, this is how much rent you owe, and here's a blank copy of this declaration where you can say, I owe this rent because of a COVID reason, so I shouldn't be evicted. And the landlord is supposed to give the tenant that declaration and that notice every month that they don't pay rent, starting in September and through January, which is kind of the period that the law works for. And that 15 days is the time period that the tenant has to return the declaration, or if they somehow magically won the lottery, which is never going to happen, then pay all the rent. And the 15 days, it doesn't include weekends and holidays, so it's like basically 3 weeks. And so that is what is supposed to happen. Landlords are supposed to give this notice. Can I have the next slide, please? And the declaration that is supposed to be attached to this notice that the landlord gives the tenant, this is basically the sort of short version of what the declaration says. It basically says, I lost income or I had some financial effect because of COVID. The good thing about this is that it's very broad. It's not just that you lost your job. It's also like, oh, my childcare expenses are higher, or I just don't have any childcare and so now I can't work, or I have a sick family member, or I have medical expenses that are increased. So it's very broad. It's intended, and the last category is other circumstances related to COVID. So this is intended, and I think it does really capture like anything hard that happened to someone financially that's related to COVID. So it's very broad categories. And the tenant does not have to prove anything. All they have to do, if it's true, they can sign this declaration and give it to their landlord, as I mentioned before, keeping proof, taking a picture. The one exception about the proof issue is if a tenant is high income, then the landlord can say they have to give proof. I hope I'm right about this, that most people in the room are focused on low income folks, so I'm not going to talk too much about that, but just know that there is sort of this exception for high income people. And high income is defined based on state area median income rules. So just as an example, in Alameda County where I live, a high income family would be a family of 4 that makes about $150,000. So folks at that level would have to sort of prove the financial reason that they can't pay rent. But everybody else does not have to prove anything. They have to sign the declaration and give it to their landlord, and they have to do that every month. So it's quite burdensome in terms of like, submit the declaration, do it again, prove it every single time. But that is the basic structure. Next slide, please. And Will, I apologize, I neglected to look at the time when I started, so please just give me a heads up if I need to speed up, okay? Okay, so how to respond. If the tenant gets a notice, they need to seek legal help right away. This is so confusing. It is really, really helpful to get an attorney. And so I mentioned before, there's that website that you can look up the local services. And if this declaration language that I just showed you, if that's true for the tenant, they should sign the declaration and give it to their landlord with proof. And also know that if the tenant misses that deadline, they don't submit the declaration within 15 days, they get another chance. That's not the end. You still get a chance to do it again. The next slide, please. So the idea of this law, as I mentioned at the beginning, is it's supposed to provide permanent protection from eviction, not just hitting the pause button, but saying you can never be evicted even though you weren't able to pay this money. And again, it's structured in this way that is so confusing and makes unnecessary just complexity where there doesn't have to be some, but let me try to explain it. It has these 2 time periods for that rent that is supposed to be sort of protected. The first one is from March 1st to August 31st. And so if someone did not pay any rent for that whole period of time, they should never be evicted for that debt as long as they submit that declaration that I just explained, as long as they submit that declaration to their landlord within 15 days of getting it from their landlord. And I mentioned there's sort of another bite at the apple. That is the idea, is you're supposed to get permanent protection from not paying that rent for that whole period of time. Then there's another period that's protected, but even more complicated. So from September, like the beginning of this month, until January of next year, there also is this protection, but the tenant has to submit that declaration every single month, not just one time, but every month that they can't pay, they have to submit the declaration again. And they also have to be able to pay 25% of their rent. And this, just in case you're not confused enough yet, that 25%, you don't have to pay it every month. You just have to be able to pay a lump sum, like the whole amount stuck together, which would be 125%, like 1.25 months rent, by the end of January. So, I mean, it's like theoretically, this is a very strong protection because you can never be evicted for that rent you didn't pay, but it's so complicated to do. It's like I've tried with many partners to make sort of like a one-page sheet, like you always want to make, that's easy to read, that you can translate into many languages and still have it fit on one page. And like trying to explain this, it's really hard. But this is the idea that if the tenant is able to submit these declarations in time and then pay that quarter of their rent for the September to January time period, then they can never be evicted for that period of rent. Another thing that I just want to flag as sort of a giant loophole is that this whole law, all it talks about is cases, eviction cases that are based on non-payment of rent, where the landlord writes on the paper, this is because you're not paying your rent. That does not do anything for something where the landlord says, oh, I think maybe you left your shoes on the balcony, or you were hanging your laundry when you weren't supposed to, and that's why I'm evicting you. So it leaves this ability for landlords to just pretend that the eviction is for another reason. The one thing that it sort of does to help with that is it says if an eviction is based on something that's not related to rent, like, you know, you hung your laundry, but seriously, this is a case that I worked on, then the landlord is not, the court will not give them all that back rent. So I guess that helps a little bit, but it really doesn't stop these sort of fake evictions from happening. Okay, next slide, please. So the other, besides, so I just sort of mentioned this is all focused on non-payment. The one other thing that this law does for other types of cases is it says all tenants in the state get just cause protection. I think people are probably familiar with this idea, but last year there was legislation that we sponsored that was established this protection statewide, saying that a landlord has to state a reason in order to evict someone. So normally landlords, and this is not so true in the Bay Area because most places in the Bay Area have local ordinances, but if you don't have local protections, a landlord can just say, I want you to leave in 30 days, bye, and not say anything. It totally invites discriminatory conduct where the real reason that the landlord is evicting someone is because of discrimination. But so that's why we have to stop it. But what this law says is nobody can be evicted without a reason. It has to be a good reason. It has to be one of the reasons listed in the law. And one specific thing that people ask about a lot is like, is the end of the lease, is that a good reason? No, it is not. You cannot evict someone just because their lease is over. That just turns into a month-to-month tenancy. They can't be evicted. And then again, this is just like really hard to figure out how to sort of explain, but the CDC order actually is even stronger than the state law in this respect. And it says tenants cannot be evicted for like the owner saying they're going to move in, or a family member is going to move in, or the owner saying, I'm not going to rent this building at all and doing an Ellis Act eviction. So for people who qualify for the CDC, there's even a stronger protection. But again, all of this is just really confusing to like help people be able to use. I feel like I'm being very depressing. I'm sorry about that. Next slide, please. Thanks to all of you, everyone is going to know the protections and be able to use them. Okay, so that was kind of outlining the basic structure of the state law. Now I want to just say a few words about how this interacts with local protections. Again, it's really, the statute is so confusing. I've had so many conversations with people who all they do all day is eviction defense, and we're reading this like 100 times, like, what does this mean? So what it says is that local eviction protections that were passed in response to COVID that are adopted after August 19th are just paused. So if right now a new law is passed for local protections for COVID, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to like undo it in a second, then that would be paused. They wouldn't go into effect until February. So that's sort of ridiculous because it seems to be blocking local governments from protecting their own community. So that seems terrible, but I'm going to tell you why you can maybe get around that in a minute. Older ordinances, anything that was passed before August 19th, that just stays. So it's not affected. And there's this other part of the law that says local governments still have the power to enact new just cause protections. And so it's like, wait a second, I thought you just told me that I couldn't pass anything after August 19th, but wait, I can, as long as it's a just cause protection. So it's very confusing to figure out how to work those things together. But my reading of it is that if you are working in advocating with your local government, or if you are the local government, you have the ability to pass more just cause protections, and just cause being like narrowing the basis for eviction. So to say, right now in my community, I don't want anyone to be evicted unless it's really an emergency, unless there's some like major thing happening that needs to, the tenant really has to get out. So you can do that because it says specifically local governments can do more just cause. It's just confusing how these things interact with each other. So I don't really know how to make that less complicated, but I feel like there is room for great local advocacy. You just have to kind of craft things in a careful way. In addition to that confusion, the CDC order also has this language that's just like, local government should feel free to do something more protective. So even though our state law seems to say, no, local governments, you can't do anything after August 19th, it's like, well, wait, the federal government said I can do something, and they win. So this is a really complicated area. There's also some language about non-payment stuff that I'm not going to go into because that's just going to make everyone's head explode. But it's really confusing. But I think it leaves room. I think there is room for great local advocacy and stronger protections that are easier to use at the local government. And I'll just stop talking and people can ask questions. Next slide, please. Okay.
Madeline, we are at
yes.
time, so if you could just kind of like wrap from here.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So take-home message is please encourage folks, if they get a notice, go to legal aid, and keep copies of anything that you send to your landlord, keep proof. And if someone does not qualify, actually, can you just go to the next slide, or maybe 2 slides? Can you show me the next slide? There, thank you. So I'll just really quickly run through people who don't qualify for AB 3888. These are just very quick explanations of people who might not be protected by state law, but benefit from federal law. So if someone lost income because they got in a car accident, or they got cancer, or some horrible thing happened that's not related to COVID, they can still get CDC protection. If they got an eviction notice that was based on, oh, the landlord wants to move in, or Ellis Act, they can be protected by the CDC. If there's already been a judgment filed in their case, they already went through the whole court process, they can be protected by the CDC. Or if they owe rent from before March 1st. So there's a whole lot of folks who can benefit from the federal order. And I put the link there where you can find the declaration. And I will stop talking. I'm sorry that I used too much time.